Herbs always have a place in my garden. Today I'm going to share with you the 11 kitchen herbs I always grow, plus tips to grow them successfully. The first thing you need to know about herbs is that you can roughly divide them into two categories: annual herbs and perennial herbs. Annual herbs are those that you'll plant every year, and perennial herbs are the ones that will come back year after year depending on your winter. Now, if your winter gets too cold for certain perennial herbs, then you will treat them as annual herbs and you'll plant them new each season. Let's talk about the 4 annual herbs that I grow in my garden, and then we'll move on to the 7 perennial herbs. The first is basil. Basil is probably the easiest herb to grow as long as you understand that it does not like the cold weather, it loves the warm weather and even the hot weather. You can direct sow basil seeds directly in your garden, or you can plant as transplants. And the key to being able to get basil all season long is to prune them as soon as they start to develop signs of flowering, and all you have to do is pinch it here at this Y stem, and then it'll continue producing more basil leaves. I love using basil fresh during the season. I also dry it in my dehydrator, and I make basil pesto year round. So basil is one that I always make sure I have room for in the garden. The next one I always grow is parsley. Now, technically parsley is a biennial, which means ideally it will grow all of its leaves in the first season, and then it will overwinter, and in the second season it will produce flowers. This is actually a great thing for parsley, even though I plant it every year. What it means is that these leaves will continue to produce spring, summer, fall, and in my climate, I can even get parsley over the winter. You can plant parsley from seed indoors to give it a head start, but usually I purchase transplants at the garden center, and I use parsley by eating it fresh. Lots of recipes call for it as a garnish at the end, but I also dehydrate it in the dehydrator to be able to have ground parsley all season long. The next herb I try to grow in my garden year after year is cilantro. Now, cilantro can be difficult for many gardeners, especially new gardeners, because cilantro actually does not love growing in the spring. It won't grow in the summer in most places. It's a cool weather herb that loves the fall, and it even thrives in my winter in zone 8A. The key with cilantro is to plant it then either in the fall or in the very early spring, because once temperatures start getting into the 70s, it starts to bolt. I can tell that my cilantro is getting ready to bolt because the leaves are becoming feathery, which is a telltale sign that this is starting to happen. Now, you can let cilantro continue to go to flower. The pollinators love it, and then it will develop coriander seeds, which you could harvest for coriander if you want. But a lot of times I will just let my coriander seeds drop, and then they will start to sprout in the fall, and that's when I get my best harvest, is when they volunteer in the season that they want to grow in. So cilantro, even though it can be a little bit challenging, especially if you're a new gardener, it's one that I always try to keep in my garden and grow it in the right time of year. The next herb I love having in my kitchen garden is dill. Not only can I use dill fresh and use it in pickles, whether I use the fronds like this, the leaves, or I let it go to seed and then you have dill seed, but I also like to dry it, especially the leaves here. I can dry it and use it as dried dill all season long, use it in ranch dressing seasoning mix, all sorts of uses for dill. Most of the time I recommend growing dill from seed. It's super easy to grow from seed. I have not found it so easy to grow indoors and transplant, but directly sowing it in the garden works well. But if you've gotten a late start to the season, dill really doesn't love the heat, so the earlier you can get it planted in the spring, the better. For this one, I actually did buy transplants, even though I do prefer to grow it from seed usually, and it's a fabulous herb to be able to put in your regular garden. You can grow it in a container like I have in my green stock, but I also love growing it in raised beds or in the ground as well. Don't forget, dill is called dill weed for a reason, so if you do let it go to seed, it will readily self-sow, which I love because that means more dill, but keep that in mind if you grow dill in your garden. Those are the annual herbs I grow in my kitchen garden, which means I plant them every season. Before we get into the perennial herbs, I wanted to let you know that if you are interested in a deep dive into exactly how to grow kitchen herbs successfully, I will be hosting a live online workshop called The Beginner's Guide to Growing Herbs on Thursday, May 16th at 7 p.m. Central Time. I'll teach when to plant these herbs and how to grow them, where to plant, how many herbs you need to plant in the first place, whether to expect them to last year after year in your climate. This will especially properly apply to the perennial herbs I'm getting ready to talk about, and how to care for them throughout the season. To get your ticket, you can go to journeywithjill.net/herb workshop, or the link will be in the description. Now, if you're watching this after the workshop or you can't make it live, you can still get your ticket, which will give you access to the replay that will be available to you throughout 2024. These workshops we've been doing about every month this year, and people have really enjoyed them, and I love getting to know you, especially if you're able to come live. So to get your ticket, go to journeywithjill.net/herb workshop. Now let's talk about the perennial herbs that I always grow in my garden, which is kind of a misnomer because they come back year after year, so I guess that's assumed that they always grow in my garden. But anyway, let's go take a look. The first perennial herb we have is peppermint, and I believe I've had this same plant for maybe 10 years. Peppermint is a fun plant to grow, but it can be invasive, which is why I keep it in a container. Never plant this in your raised bed or in your ground bed because it will spread and take over and you'll have trouble getting rid of it. But if you can keep it in a container, it's going to last you year after year. Now, one thing I have to do every couple of years is I have to take the plant and divide it. And that's basically a fancy term for saying that I need to remove some of the plant, including some of the root system, because otherwise it'll just continue outgrowing the container and will not be able to get enough water that it needs throughout the season to thrive. So every few years, I'll usually just take a knife and take half the plant out completely. I'll usually throw it out in the woods because I do not want that in my compost pile. And then the plant itself will continue to grow and I'm able to harvest it. Usually I harvest it once in the spring when it's flush and beautiful like this. And then in the summer, it will tend to die back, or sometimes it'll develop flowers. And after those die back, I'll cut down the scraggly stems and then the plant itself will regrow. And often I'm able to harvest it again in the fall before it goes semi-dormant in the winter time before coming back again in the spring. Next, I have thyme. Thyme is one that I use in cooking quite often. This particular kind of thyme is lemon thyme. I found it at a local nursery and I absolutely love the lemon flavor, but you can get regular thyme as well. Thyme will come back year after year, and if it does flower like you might be able to see here, no big deal. You can harvest it pretty much all season long. However, the best quality of leaves are going to be right now in the spring. Sometimes thyme will start to get a little woody after a few years. In that case, I will often divide it like I shared about doing with peppermint, or I may just start over with a new plant every few years, just depending on what I feel like doing. But thyme is a perfect container planted herb, and for the most part, it's not going to spread and invade other herb spaces, although over the years you may find that it does kind of take over the container that you have, but it's definitely not a problem the first few years. Next, I have rosemary, and I hope you can see it. I actually have it in the middle of my cilantro here, and looks like some errant chickweed, but anyway, the reason I planted it with my cilantro is because I knew my cilantro wouldn't last very long, so it was a companion planting combination. The reason I had to plant a new rosemary plant this year was because it did not survive our winter last year. I had that trouble the last 2 seasons. Even though we're zone 8A and rosemary is perennial technically to zone 7, I have found that if you get a really hard cold snap, sometimes it won't make it, especially if it's a younger plant. I ended up losing my mature rosemary plant when we got down into the negatives, even though I tried to cover it. So I started over with a new plant. Now, I have had rosemary survive for me for many years, and once it got to be a mature plant, I really didn't feel like I would have any issues with it, but one winter can definitely cause it to die, and in that case, I start over with a new plant. But rosemary is a plant that for the most part stays contained. It will get taller and may eventually need to be transplanted into a bigger container, but I love including rosemary in my garden. Super low maintenance, no fuss plant. Moving over here, I've got oregano, and this is another plant that I think I've had for 10 years. Oregano is perennial in my climate and many other zones. And the beautiful thing about oregano is when it comes back again in the spring, it's lush and full, and this is a great time to harvest. Now, oregano will start to develop flowers in the summer, but it's not like basil in that means it's gonna die, but it's part of its normal process. So what'll end up happening in the summer is that it'll develop flowers, and then those stalks will become very woody. And what you can do in the late summer and fall is to cut them down, and then the plant will regrow from the bottom. But then in the fall, it will start to regrow, and I can get another harvest in the fall before it starts to die back in the winter. The main thing about oregano is, like peppermint, it does like to spread, so I like to keep it in its own container, and it's It's also very thirsty, so this is the crop that I need to keep watered more than probably any other of my herbs. But it also will let you know when it needs watering. It tends to be a little droopy and it perks right back up when you water it. Obviously, it's been easy enough for me to be able to harvest and grow for 10 years, so not super fussy, but definitely does need extra attention to watering. Next, we have sage, and if sage is an herb that's perennial in your zone, it can get beautiful and full, and you can harvest it pretty much season long. I do tend to take my last harvest right before Thanksgiving because it does tend to go dormant in the winter and I don't want to stress the plant by harvesting too much. But spring is a great time to harvest, and I like to dehydrate it, and then I can harvest it all summer long, and like I said, even into the fall. But even if sage isn't perennial in your climate, you can still plant it and then harvest it in the fall before it dies back in the winter. Nearby here we have chives. These chives, you can see the blossoms have just started to fade. They are the first ones that bloom in the spring. Absolutely love them. These beautiful purple blooms. But right now, since these blossoms are starting to fade, I really need to cut back these stems. But chives can be harvested pretty much all year long, but like other herbs, their best quality is going to be in the spring. Still, I can harvest them usually all summer, fall, winter, year-round, but they really start to show out in the early spring. And the great thing about chives is that even if you plant a small plant in the beginning, it tends to spread over the years. This actually started out as one plant and I've had to divide it like 3 times. So it's definitely one to keep an eye on if you don't want it to be spreading to lots of other places in your garden, but it's a super easy one to plant in your garden and grow when you plant once, and then you can have it for years. Finally, I have marjoram. Now, marjoram is technically a perennial plant, but only to zone 8. And last year when we went down to 0 degrees, which is below what zone 8 normally would be, I did lose my marjoram, so I had to plant again. I planted from seed. Very similar to oregano, even though oregano is going to last over the winter in most places, whereas marjoram is going to be one that most of us will have to plant every season. It also doesn't love the heat, so if you live in a hot climate, you may not be able to get it to last all summer, but you could overwinter it. I like marjoram because oregano tends to be a little bit more pungent, whereas marjoram has a sweeter flavor, and I use it somewhat interchangeably with oregano, but especially in recipes that call for marjoram, it's definitely one of those herbs that's enjoyable to have on hand. And sometimes it's hard to find marjoram fresh from the grocery store. I start marjoram from seed indoors just because I've had a hard time finding true marjoram from transplant at the garden center. But if you can find a marjoram transplant, that would definitely be the easier way to do it because it does take marjoram quite a while to be able to grow from seed. Don't forget, I'll be going even more in depth into all of these herbs in the live herb workshop. You can go to journeywithjill.net/herb workshop to get your ticket. But we also have a free herb planting guide that you can download in the description below. It will tell you which herbs are perennial, annual, depending on your zone, their water needs, that kind of thing. So even if you can't make it to the workshop, make sure and download that free guide to give you a quick at-a-glance way to be able to plant herbs successfully in your garden. So I would love to know from you, are there any kitchen herbs that you would add to my list that I didn't include that you love to grow? And if so, how do you use them? That's the biggest question sometimes that I ask myself, is if I see an herb at the garden center, do I use that normally, or how would I use that normally? I would love to hear from you if there are any that you would add to my list. And one more thing, if you're a podcast listener, I'll be going more in depth into these herbs, and I'll be adding 4 medicinal herbs that I always include in my garden in next week's podcast episode on the Beginner's Garden podcast. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and it's starting to get a little bit drizzly, so I'm gonna get inside. Have a great day.